Let's face it, we all have issues. Issues can become problems. Problems without proper resolution can result into something greater, in this case, mental illness. This program attempts to not only acknowledge our state of mental health, but start the conversation on the road to solutions. In our communities, we all know about the system of mass incarceration. But do we actually pay attention to the system of mass miseducation that leads to mass incarceration, also known as the school-to-prison pipeline? Is our definition of a good education detrimental to what we really need? In this episode, we will discuss the perspectives of education through the eyes of our communities. Please, join us.
Denial, embarrassment, hopelessness, miseducation, misperception, lack of help. We are out of our minds. The state of mental health in African American communities.
So will you tell me about the Minority Behavioral Health Group school programs and services to start with?
Yes. So first I'll say that Minority Behavioral Health Group is a community mental health agency that specializes in providing community mental health services, comprehensive culturally specific services. Basically what that means is our service delivery is tailored to a particular community, the African American community specifically. And so we try to provide holistic care, which means that although we have a clinic here on Copley Road, we also provide services in the homes, in the community, and in the schools. So we are currently in Akron Public Schools. We are in a couple local charter schools and a private school. And what we do is we have a therapist and a case manager team that goes into the schools, and children who are identified or who are presenting with certain behavioral challenges, certain emotional challenges, they are screened and evaluated by a therapist. And then the therapist will do with a comprehensive mental health assessment where they'll talk to the teachers, they'll talk to the family, any other stakeholders that are involved with the child, and then develop a service plan that will ultimately deal with whatever issues or needs that the client might have.
So you're trying to give members of our community a specifically tailored type of help that they might not be able to get somewhere else, is that right?
Absolutely.
And what do you all hope the impact of your work will be?
So our agency really ascribed to an African-centered philosophy and treatment approach. So when we speak of being culturally specific, I am talking particularly about getting back to African values. And the reason that that's important is because the literature is starting to highlight the protective factor of an African-centered value system and belief system. So if we ascribe to African-centered values, we are less likely to have behavioral or emotional challenges, and we are more likely to see success academically. And so when we're thinking about a school-based model, and the limitations of school-based models are really limited to behaviors that children are presenting with, which leads itself to suspensions and expulsions, then to the juvenile justice system. And so what we attempt to do is not focus on deficits and behaviors, but to instill African-centered values that will likely protect against the negative stereotypes, prejudices that the African American community experiences.
So it's a lack of African-centered values in African American communities that's harming us. So basically, so it's more of the Western way of doing things.
Absolutely.
It's not working out for us.
It's not. It's not culturally conducive. It actually sets up a system of oppression, and then you have African Americans who are disadvantaged attempting to reach values, and the Western idea is values are related to monetary power, things of that nature.
And we're spiritual people.
And we're spiritual people, so that's a big disconnect. And so when we are trying to reach something that resources really doesn't allow us to have, imagine the psychological distress, anxiety and depression that comes along with that.
Yeah, now that's not really a common, something that a lot of us know about. That's not a thing that, like, because I've never heard that before. But that's been, so how are people receptive to what you're trying to teach them?
Yes, people are open. We do a lot of professional development in the community. We go out into the school systems. We don't only work with the children, but we provide education and professional development to the teachers. We provide education and information to the parents. So anyone who has an impact on a child also receives this resource and information as well.
Okay, so you mentioned that a lack of that African-centered values being taught to us could cause some damage if we're not educated about that. So this episode is titled "The Shackles of Education." The shackles of education. Do you think that that's harsh? Would you say that education, as we know it in America, places shackles on members of the African American community, literally or figuratively speaking?
Yes, it's significantly limiting. And again, education is a system that instills values. It shapes our individuals. It socializes our community, our children. And if those values and the socialization process is on the dominant culture and the dominant way of viewing, then it's not really consistent. It's not culturally consistent with the African American community. Our experience is very different. What we value is very different from a Western perspective. So in education, and there's two different philosophies that I'm aware of. One philosophy is to push society's agenda, and the other philosophy is really towards getting back to understanding who we are as a cultural being, understanding who you are as a cultural person, increasing your cultural identity, your sense of self, is ultimately going to improve your academic success.
So the word educate derives from the Latin word educere, educere, which means to bring out or to lead forth. What is the education system as we know it bringing out of African American youth, or what is it leading them to?
Well, it's leading to, unfortunately, a sense of inferiority. The messages that are being instilled in the African American youth, even if you just look at the rate that they are suspended and expelled with other non-African Americans, the messages that are being instilled is a sense of inferiority, a sense of feeling devalued, a sense of feeling dehumanized. And so they're in a system where it's very difficult for them to understand or to receive the lesson or to benefit from the information, because it's influenced by these psychological messages that are playing out in their day-to-day interactions. The community is impoverished, okay? So kids are coming to school, they may not have the same material things that other students have. They may not be as appropriately dressed. They may not be fed. They may come from homes where utilities are disconnected. They may come from homes where domestic violence and community violence is a problem. And so they present in school either anxious, what I'll say, or fearful, or difficulty concentrating. And when African American youth in particular present in their schools, when you think about their home and community experiences, to the educators, it's over pathologized or even criminalized to oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder. And when you think about those types of disorders, if you will, it has significant implications as it relates to how the educators are dealing with the African American youth in particular.
Okay, so you mentioned a little bit about low-income communities. You talked about how they're affected. Now, what if you came from the Huxtable House? What if you didn't come from a low-income community? Would it still have a negative impact on you if you're African American, if you came from an affluent household?
Yes, it does, because what we're talking about is a worldview. We're talking about a value system. So if you have a value system that is not consistent with who you are as a cultural being, there's a conflict there. And at some point in life, you're going to bump into that. There are studies at in the universities, in white universities, where individuals were African American, affluent, if you will, college educated individuals were given they were part of a research study. In the study, they were screened for depression and anxiety and other psychological disorders, and they were also given a worldview inventory. So the worldview inventory really pulls forward the type of worldview that they adhere to, whether it's African-centered, which is based in African-centered value systems, or if it's a more Eurocentric ideology. And what the studies have found, and it's been several, is that individuals who endorse a more Eurocentric worldview are more likely to experience depression or anxiety and have a more difficult time with coping. And the individuals who adhere more to an African-centered value system were less likely to experience depression and anxiety, but when they did, they were more able to cope and adjust and adapt academically, socially, interpersonally, and etc.
Well, why do you think that is? Because for me, I would think it would be the other way around. I would think that adapting to the African way in a Western world, you'd really be in a minority. How do you think that? How do you think that happens?
So you know, it's all about what we value and what we believe in. So in the African-centered value system worldview, we believe in collectivism. We believe in spirit. We believe in spirituality. The way we kind of make sense of our experiences is from a diurnal perspective. The way that we think about who we are is based off of who our ancestors were, who the yet unborn will be, what our contributions are to our community, who we are to our family. So all of those things is what's important in the African-centered value system. In a Eurocentric value system, emphasis is really placed on being an individual. Things are pretty much segmented. It's either or, it's black or white. Yeah. Your worth is defined based off of how much you have. Yeah. And so at any given moment, those things could change, right? They could change. And when they change, how do we then adjust psychologically? Well, what the research will tell you is we fall apart. There's significant anxiety, there's depression, there's suicide. So these are the consequences of adhering to a worldview that's really not intended for minority populations.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. So they're miseducated. We're being miseducated.
Miseducated is an understatement. Yes.
Is the miseducation intentional? Would you, in your opinion, is it intentional?
Yes. Yes. It stems, I mean, when you think of historically how we got here, the experiences, the period of enslavement, then Jim Crow. When you think about the experience of the African American dating back to the period of enslavement, it's definitely generational patterns of behavior that is stemming in modern day times. Right. So it was intentional because it was a way to control. You no longer need slaves if you can control the psychological mindset of individuals. And unfortunately, we are miseducated. The other piece to that is we then internalize the miseducation. For example, oppression, racism is real. It's what our community deals with every day. And if we don't understand or recognize, or if we're miseducated about it, we then internalize that distress. And that's where you see the psychological problems, depression, suicide, anxiety, and etc. in the African American community.
Wow. Wow. Okay. So this whole program is about mental health. So how does miseducation affect our youth? How does it affect, how does it affect their mental state? I'll say that. Or can it manifest into some type of serious mental issue down the line?
Yes, it's significantly impacting. And that's one area that the education system is missing. There's a big gap. There's a significant psychological component to education because there are internal messages that we are receiving. There are values that are being instilled. And when it's based off of a worldview or an idea that is outside of who we are as cultural beings, then it makes us feel inferior. It makes us feel hopeless. It makes us feel discouraged. And so you may see some behaviors, or you may see lack of motivation. You may see a lack of effort because the discouragement is there.
Yeah.
And so if we are miseducated, then we internalize those things, and then you see a raise in school dropouts, an increase in the prison population. And this is the impact of really trying to adhere to a value system that is really not intended for us.
Do you think parents in any way contribute to or foster the miseducation? Or would that be easy to do because they were miseducated themselves?
Absolutely.
So it's a cycle.
It's a cycle. It's a cycle. And so yes, and that's a very important point. What I want to highlight, even when we work with our parents and what parents deal with in the education system, they are ostracized. They are made to be the villain. It's your problem. You are a bad parent. No, that is not the case. But they have their own belief system. They have their own experience of how they were miseducated. And so educating our parents helps to manage the children.
Right.
Educating the school to some degree kind of helps manage what our children are experiencing day to day in their school systems.
You talk about educating the school. Do you think that the school is interested in being educated about this? Because like I was saying, you know, this is an idea I've never heard about. It's not a common idea.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think it'll take for the schools to notice this and turn the ship around?
Yes, so the schools we are involved with are very receptive. They evaluate us every year. They see the need. They allow us to come into their days of professional development and present. So they're very open and receptive. The challenge is, and I think because they see the crises,
yeah.
So they have to do something. The schools are not performing well.
Yeah.
Too many children are being suspended and expelled. So the state is looking at that. So they have to do something. And so they are asking mental health providers to come into the buildings to provide some support. Now the difference is the service delivery that we provide is holistic and is culturally specific. So you may have other agencies providing school-based services, but again, if they are implementing treatment modalities that are not culturally conducive, then that does cause more harm. It actually over-pathologizes our children, yeah. And increased suspension rates, which then leads to the pipeline to prison.
Yeah.
So we have to be really careful about what that looks like. We actually educate the buildings in which we work on the whole idea of pipeline to prison.
Yeah.
So helping them to understand how behaviors present differently in African American in particular, and understanding context and things that are happening in their daily experiences, give them a different way of viewing children, and then how they intervene becomes very different.
Yeah. Does the parents sending their children out of the communities to other maybe public schools or charter schools or private schools, does that have any effect on the African American children? Yeah,
so you know, we are servicing public school, private school, and charter school.
Okay.
And there are differences as it relates to structure and what you're able to do. What I will say is public schools are more rigid as it relates to how we in particular can access the students and what we can do. There's time constraints, there's things that they, you know, rigid policies that they still have to adhere to that sometimes serve as a barrier.
Yeah.
In their charter schools, they don't have those same guidelines or policies that they have to follow. So we have more access and availability and autonomy to do more with the school staff, with the families, and with the students. And the same as it relates to the private schools. There's just more flexibility. But I think in terms of the education that the youth are receiving, again, from my professional perspective, it doesn't matter if you're in a private school, public school, or charter school. If the education you're receiving is inaccurate, or it serves as a barrier to you feeling good about yourself, if it challenges your self-efficacy, if it diminishes you as a person, then it's not effective.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter what school you go to, if the philosophy is grounded in Eurocentric ideas for an African American community, that is a significant barrier.
You said philosophy. You all work with an
African-centered philosophy.
African-centered philosophy.
Yes.
So there's a European-centered philosophy.
Absolutely.
Now, what is the difference?
So, for example, let me start with when we think about the Eurocentric idea or what they're promoting in education, everything is related to achievement, scores, if you will. And that is a sole mechanism of how the children are evaluated, through scores, standardized tests, if you will, how they're doing. And the research talks about the achievement gap. Now, if you think about the achievement gap and the differences in how African Americans are performing and how Eurocentric children are performing, there's a big disadvantage, there's a big disparity there. And then the psych impact that then has on the child that makes them feel inferior or not good enough, or I'm not able to learn, or I'm not able to succeed. Those things is what really prevents children from learning. It diminishes their interest, right? It diminishes their effort, their motivation. That's what gets in the way of learning. And if we're only focused on scores and achievement, and we're not necessarily concerned about what drives self-efficacy, effort, motivation, if we're not able to also include that into the idea, then the children, the African American children, are going to be significantly impacted every time.
Right. Can you tell me about cultural competence?
Yes. So cultural competence is this broad term, but ultimately it means that the services that you're providing, whether it's education, mental health, medical, that it fits and is consistent with the person that it is intended for. Typically, what we're doing is, you know, in the field of psychology, if you will, that's my field of study, so I'll just stick there.
Okay.
There are theories that are developed that are based on white, upper middle class men. And these theories are trained and often used to understand behavior of all people. They're assumed universal, but they were developed and intended for a specific group.
Yeah.
Typically white, upper middle class. And then everyone else is assumed to follow that same philosophy, modality, service delivery, etc.
Right.
So it's not culturally specific. What we need to do is we need to develop services, ways of educating, ways of treating that are intended for particular populations. And so that's one of the things that we strive to do here at Minority. We work with African Americans primarily because that is the population that is the most underserved based off of the research. So our service delivery is targeted and geared towards African-centered values, which is based in ancient Africa, which stems from how things all originated.
Right. Okay, you mentioned the school to prison pipeline.
Yes.
I think it's commonly heard, but it's not commonly understood. So can you kind of break that down so that we can understand it and maybe neutralize it?
Yes. So the school to prison pipeline basically is this growing issue across the nation where students are expelled or suspended from school. Those students have a higher rate of ending up in the juvenile justice system or in the adult criminal justice system. So we just look at the statistics of the U.S. Department of Education. For example, African Americans in the school population make up about 18% of the population. 40% are suspended and expelled repeatedly. Now what you have going on is you have police officers, they're considered resource officers in the schools. And so they are the ones now managing behaviors that school personnel used to manage.
Yeah.
But that's now deviated to police officers. So now the behaviors that could just be disruptive or a little hypertensive, something, is now criminalized.
Yeah.
And the suspensions are now lending itself to the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system. So basically, prisoner pipeline means that children who are suspended have a higher rate of now going into the criminal justice system. So, and it's very pronounced and prevalent today across the country.
So the seeds are sown.
Yeah.
For black incarceration when they were very young in school.
Yes. We make up, African Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population. 60% of African Americans are in prison. And when you look at the stats related to schools, preschoolers, 13% black children are in preschool across the country. At least 40% of preschoolers have been kicked out of school or suspended more than once. So again, and it gets worse the older they become.
Right, of course.
So that's what prisoner pipeline means. The more you suspend a child, the higher risk they are to get involved with the juvenile justice or adult criminal system.
Wow. Wow, the seeds are being sown, the seeds are being sown. Okay, so we've talked a whole lot. We've talked about the cycles and you know, how it all starts. It's a big problem now. And the ship is already going, it's full steam, and a lot of people don't know about maybe the African-centered way. Maybe we don't know that this is why we're cutting up and not doing what we're supposed to do. How can we turn the ship around? What do you think we could do going forward to get more people aware of what you're talking about?
So, you know, we have to read.
We have to read.
We have to read.
We have to read.
Because the information is there.
Yeah.
We have to read. We have to get involved.
Yeah.
Racial socialization is huge. We live in a society that has been racist, and it continues.
Yeah.
And we have to be able to buffer that in order to protect ourselves. We have to be able to buffer it. When we talk about racial socialization, and this actually has been found to also be a protective factor. So we have an African-centered value system that protects us against systems of oppression and racism. And then you have the whole process of racial socialization. And this is where parents are critical. But you want to have conversations with your children about what they're experiencing.
Yes.
You want to be able to educate them about your history doesn't start with the period of enslavement. It predates the period of enslavement, right? You want to be able to educate them about what they're going to experience because they are African American.
Yeah.
Then you want to show them successful African Americans. We have to expose and socialize and re-educate, if you will, our youth in order to make a difference, in order to give them a chance to be successful.
Yeah. So we really need to understand that education doesn't stop at graduation. It should be intentional. We shouldn't put it in other people's hands.
It's ongoing.
It's ongoing, but we have to be intentional about it.
And then we have to be intentional.
And crack open a book. Wow.
The correct book.
The correct book.
So you're not miseducated.
Book. Check out the bibliography,
That's
who
right.
wrote it, fact check.
That's right.
Well, doctor, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Denial, embarrassment, hopelessness, miseducation, misperception, lack of help. We are out of our minds. The state of mental health in African American communities